microphone, even though it's a more intimate group and a small space, because we are broadcasting this live on the internet. There may be tens of thousands of people watching. We have no idea, and since we have no idea, we choose to believe that there are tens of thousands of people watching. If you are watching on the internet, there's a chat room right next to the video box, and we'd love it if you came in and chatted with us, let us know you were there, and then ask questions when the time is right. I am Jack Weinstein. I'm the director of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life. We host these events, taking philosophy out of the classroom and into the community. Our flagship event, Y Radio Show, is available at yradioshow.org, and it is a monthly live, unscripted, call-in philosophy show on public radio. You can subscribe via podcast. Those of you in the audience, there's a little card with some information about it. Please feel free to take it, and if you have the information, give it to someone who you would like to know the information. We're here at the UND bookstore with Richard Gilmore, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Concordia College. How long did you say you were at Concordia for?
I think this is like my 16th or 17th year, so
16th.
A while.
Richard is a regional fellow for the Institute. We have a fellows program that brings people from actually around the world to UND for a couple weeks to do some research and to present their research to general audiences. We also have a fellowship for regional folks like Richard to strengthen the ties between our institution and other institutions, but also to provide the resources for folks in the area who want to do advanced philosophical research and then again present it to the general community. Today's talk is called When is a Pile a Heap? Some thoughts on moral vagueness, and it's dealing with the question of how to make moral decisions when the situation is ambiguous. And so I'll leave it up to Richard to talk, and let's thank Richard for coming, and thank all of you for coming.
Yep. Thank you, Jack. Yeah, thank you for coming tonight, and I do want to thank Jack and the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life. I think it's a great thing that he's doing, and I feel very honored to be a part of it. I applied for this regional fellowship because I like so much what he's doing, this idea of bringing philosophy to people in the public. You know, I get a little money as part of the fellowship, and I get a library card, and certainly the UND library is a lot larger than my library at Concordia College. But that's really not, it wasn't for the money and it wasn't for the library, it was for the idea of the thing. I love the idea of this project that Jack Weinstein has started. His Y radio program, just recently he's had on that program, talking to him, people like Charles Taylor, Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum. I mean, these are like the greatest intellectual minds that are out there today. I mean, these are to the Grand Forks, North Dakota, these huge figures in the history of philosophy, in the contemporary philosophical field. On the other hand, it's not surprising to me at all, because philosophers want to talk about philosophy, and they want to talk about philosophy with people who don't necessarily know what philosophy is about or what is going on in philosophy. So we love to talk with other philosophers, sure, that's fun, but that doesn't seem like it's that important. That doesn't seem like the important thing. The important thing, it seems like, is talking to a public audience. And for me, so I'm not surprised that Martha Nussbaum wants to talk to Jack Weinstein about philosophy. For me, it makes me think about what philosophy is about, and I have a very Nietzschean notion of what philosophy is about. And this is my reading of what Nietzsche says philosophy is about. And this is kind of put together from various different texts that Nietzsche writes in, but there's this idea, there's a wonderful book by Joseph Campbell called A Hero with a Thousand Faces, and it's about this notion that all these cultures around the world have the same hero myth, and it's a myth of this hero figure who is in a community, and something happens either inside them or something happens in their community where there's some kind of imbalance, some kind of problem has arisen, and the hero then has to leave their community and go out into the world on some kind of quest, and the quest is for knowledge or for some kind of wealth or for some kind of secret potion or for some a ring of some kind or something, and then they return to the community, and then they restore the community's health in some way. Somehow the community's out of balance, and the hero leaves the community and returns. And Joseph Campbell's reading of this myth is that this is what we all have to do. We all live in families, we all live in communities, and at some point we have to leave. We have to go out. The family gets imbalanced with our presence, and we are imbalanced by our presence. And so we need to leave, go out, but the point of our leaving is not just to leave, it's somehow also to return with new gifts, with new things to offer. And so that's what I read Nietzsche saying about what philosophy is. The philosopher doesn't necessarily leave physically the community, but the community is kind of constrained in their thinking. There are all sorts of norms of how you're supposed to think, in terms of religious norms and moral norms and economic norms. And the philosopher is the one who makes a quest, an intellectual quest, outside of the boundaries of what the community is allowed to think about, to think things that nobody dares to think about, or is afraid to think about, or just doesn't have the time and the energy to think about. But the philosophers, those are the people who just, they follow the thoughts out, the thoughts that I think everybody thinks about, but they follow them out to realms that people don't go into. But their point is not just to do it for themselves, their point is to come back, to come back to the community and share their ideas. This is what Nietzsche says. He says, what everybody loves to do is they want to bring something home. And I think that's right, and I think that's what philosophers do, and that's what I think Martha Nussbaum's doing when she talks to Jack Weinstein. She's trying to bring the things that she's thinking about and working on and reflecting on and actively engaging in back to the public life. And that's why I think it's such an honor for me to be able to work with this Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, because that gives me an opportunity to do this what I think is really great and fun and interesting stuff. So for me today, I'm going to talk about this ancient paradox. It's the paradox of the heap. It's called the Sorites paradox. And it was invented by this ancient Greek philosopher Eubulides of Miletus. Miletus is sort of off the coast of Turkey. And Eubulides lived at about the same time as Aristotle. And he's famous for inventing these these crazy paradoxes that bother people. And apparently there's one story anyway that there was a public debate between Aristotle and Eubulides actually won the debate, which was apparently the only time that Aristotle ever did not win a public debate. And if Eubulides did win a public debate with Aristotle, my guess is he won it with the Sorites paradox. So that I'm fascinated by the Sorites paradox. And it's called the paradox of the heap. Soros is the Greek word for heap. So it's the paradox of the heap. And this is the paradox of the heap. If you have a few grains of sand, say, it's not a heap. It's just it's sort of an aggregate of sand. And if you add a grain of sand to those few grains of sand, it's still not a heap. And if you add another grain of sand to those grains of sand, it's still not a heap. And it seems to be the case that there's no condition under which you could add one grain of sand and convert a non-heap to a heap. But if you keep adding grains of sand, at some point you have a heap of sand there. And it goes the other direction too. That is, you have a heap of sand. There's a heap of sand, and you remove a grain of sand, it's still a heap. And if you remove another grain of sand, it's still a heap. And it seems to be there's no condition under which you could remove one grain of sand and convert a heap of sand to a non-heap. And yet, if you keep removing grains of sand, at some point there's no heap of sand there. There's no sand there at all even. So that's the paradox of the heap. And this is a very puzzling paradox. Why is this such a problem? And basically it's a problem of vagueness, because the concept of a heap is a vague concept. We kind of know it when we see it. And there's kind of we know there's no heap there, and we kind of know there's a heap there. But there's kind of an in-between realm where it's sort of not clear whether this is a heap or not a heap. And that in-between zone is generally referred to, this is a term from Bertrand Russell, is the penumbral area, sort of a dark, ambiguous area of maximum ambiguity. So that's the paradox of the heap. And it's about how the world, what I think that this Sorites paradox shows us is that the world itself is vague. That there's vagueness in every part of the world that we encounter, that we experience. So people who work with there's a classic version. Everybody who writes about the Socrates paradox always invents their own Socrates paradoxes because it's innumerable, the paradoxes you can invent. Classic ones are these are very traditional, is the paradox of the bald man. So, you have a full head of hair, and if you remove one hair, is the man bald? And the answer is no. And if you remove another hair, is the man bald? And it seems to be the case that there's no condition under which you could remove one of this guy's hairs and convert a hairy man to a bald man, and yet at some point, if you remove all the hairs, he's bald. So that's another example. There's an example by this philosopher Peter Unger, and he uses the example of a swizzle stick, for stirring your drinks in bars. And I think that that's why he chose a swizzle stick, is because it's for stirring drinks in bars. But he does it in terms of removing a molecule from a swizzle stick. So if you remove a molecule from a swizzle stick, it's still a swizzle stick. And if you remove another molecule from a swizzle stick, it's still a swizzle stick. But at some point, if you keep removing molecules, it seems to be the case that there's no one molecule you could remove and transform a swizzle stick to a non-swizzle stick, but at some point it's not a swizzle stick when you remove all the molecules. So this can be any kind of thing. And again, I think it's because, I'll go into more detail why I think this is about the world. It's not just this logical paradox. It's that the world is vague. There's a sort of inherent vagueness in the world. And I think that inherent vagueness in the world is because the world is constantly changing. It's constantly evolving. And so nothing is what it is for more than a moment, really, in some sense. I mean, some things are more stable and some things are less stable, but everything is constantly changing. And so there's a certain inherent vagueness in the world itself that the Socrates paradox kind of draws out. But I want to tell you about my own, as it were, discovery of the Socrates paradox, because so this is a thing that happens to philosophers sometimes. I certainly don't want to make any claims to myself as being any kind of special philosopher, but I think I've had this little experience with the Socrates paradox that is kind of like experiences that I've read about other philosophers having. There's Kant was awakened from his dogmatic slumber by an essay by Hume, and there's Descartes apparently had his whole revelation about his whole philosophy from a dream, and there's a great story about Wittgenstein where Wittgenstein's early philosophy was all about trying to construct a philosophy to eliminate vagueness from our language, that our language is inherently vague, or it has this problem of vagueness for Wittgenstein in his early writings, and he was going to eliminate the vagueness with his logical analysis of language. And he's having this argument with an Italian economist, and they're on a train, and the Italian economist's name is Sraffa. And they're arguing about the logical structure of language. And Sraffa makes this gesture. It's a very Italian gesture. He goes like that. I don't even know what that means. I think it's a bad thing to do. I probably shouldn't do it like in front of you. But he does that gesture, and he says, what's the logical structure of that? And it was like that was the end of his whole youthful philosophy. It was like, whoa, okay, right. Because Wittgenstein knew that meant something, and he knew that there was no precise logical formula for what that meant. It was a vague kind of thing that was meaningful, but there was no logical formula for it. So my moment like that was I was going for a Q-tip in our cupboard. We have in our medicine cabinet in our kitchen. We have a cupboard. We have a glass with Q-tips. It's full of Q-tips. And the idea of these Q-tips is that we have a box of Q-tips under the sink. And then we have a glass of Q-tips in the medicine cabinet, and we keep the glass full of Q-tips so that we can just pick one out when we want to use a Q-tip, and we don't have to, mess with going under the cupboard and getting the box out. And so this one day, I went to the glass to get a Q-tip, and there were 3 Q-tips in the glass, and this suddenly struck me as an immense problem. So I'm staring at this glass with 3 Q-tips. And, what's the problem? What's the problem with 3 Q-tips? There is a problem with 3 Q-tips, right? Especially if you live in a household with somebody else. My wife, I live in a household with my wife. And 3 Q-tips is a problem. I would never take the last Q-tip and leave the glass empty. That would be just inviting disaster, right? So my wife comes in, empty glass, there's hell to pay. But if you think about that, if one Q-tip in a glass, if leaving the glass empty is bad, then because it's forcing her to fill the glass, right? If I leave one Q-tip if I leave no Q-tips in, then I put the burden of filling this glass of Q-tips with Q-tips. That's morally reprehensible. So I won't do that. I would never leave the glass empty. But if I leave one Q-tip, if there are two Q-tips and I take one and I leave one, and I know that she's a moral person and would never leave a glass empty of Q-tips, forcing me to fill the glass because that would be morally reprehensible, then if there are two Q-tips and I take one, I kind of have to fill the glass again, right? Because otherwise I'm forcing her to take the last Q-tip and fill the glass, and then that's the same as leaving the glass empty. But then if there's that moral pressure to fill the glass with Q-tips when there's two Q-tips, then of course there's moral pressure to fill the glass when there are three Q-tips, etc. And it suddenly occurred to me, this is a Socrates problem. When is it your moral responsibility to fill the glass? And clearly there are polarities there, right? I mean, when the glass is full, there's no moral responsibility to fill the glass whatsoever. When it's half full, I think there's very little moral responsibility to put any more Q-tips in. When the glass is empty, absolute moral responsibility. You can't leave a glass empty. So the question is, well, there's a penumbral area. And the penumbral area hits you about, if you're thinking about these things, which I do, 6 or 7 Q-tips down to maybe 3 or 4 Q-tips, right? I mean, 2 Q-tips pretty clear. 3 Q-tips, I don't know, maybe I can go another day. Maybe, she won't notice, she won't think about it. Anyway. So this was an example of, for me, a moral Socrates. That is, it's a problem of vagueness with my moral responsibility with respect to the Q-tip glass. And the more I started thinking about this, the more I started thinking that most moral situations are like the Q-tip glass. Most of the moral situations that we find ourselves in have some kind of element of inherent vagueness. And there are various different ways people try and solve the Socrates paradox. A way that logicians try to, because philosophers hate this paradox because it's confounding. They just don't like it, and so they try and solve it. That's what philosophers do. They take it as a problem and they try and solve it. The most common way of trying to solve the Socrates paradox is with what they call sharpenings. A sharpening is an arbitrary number. So you say, with respect to the heap, you say, well, we'll just say 50 grains of sand is a heap. When there are 50 grains of sand, you take 1 grain of sand away, it's not a heap anymore. That's the way a sharpening works. There's an obvious problem with that, and that is that it seems to be that there's still a heap there. So you can define it any way you want, but the experience is the same. That's still a heap. It looks identical to the way it looked before you took the 1 grain of sand away. So the sharpenings sort of covers over the inherent ambiguity of the situation. It doesn't really solve the problem of the Socrates. But there's another way in which I think sharpening can be very helpful, and so with respect to my moral dilemma of the Q-tip glass, what I had to do was I had to figure out a kind of a vague but more specific kind of sharpening to solve this problem, which is what I started working on. So I started thinking about, well, how should I think about this in the future? How should I think about this Q-tip glass in the future? My sense is pretty strong that 3 Q-tips is pretty morally demanding. But 4 Q-tips seems like it's not that morally demanding. And 5 Q-tips I'm not too sure about at all. And by the time I get up to 7, I don't feel like I need to fill the Q-tip jar at all, the glass. So that becomes a kind of sharpening. And so what I think of something like 5 Q-tips is going to be the thing that the day I see 5 Q-tips is the day I start worrying about it. And if I have time and I'm ready for class, I'll go under the counter, pick out the box, put a bunch in, take care of the situation. But if I'm really in a rush and I'm really hurried, I may say, well, there are 5. I got a couple more days. I got to go. I got to go. And so I have made a kind of arrangement for myself. So what is the lessons? What are the lessons of this idea of moral vagueness and the Q-tip jar? And so I'm claiming that I think all ethical questions, almost all ethical questions. I mean, there are some that seem very clear, and there are some that clearly yes, clearly know. But I think most of them that we encounter are penumbral. And I think this covers almost all the elements of our life. I mean, for example, you could think about the question of racism. You know, how many reactions do you have to have? How many racist thoughts do you have to have before you're a racist? I mean, if you have one racist thought every once in a while, does that make you a racist? If you have two, if you have three, I mean, at some point, I think you're a racist. And I think sometimes people have these thoughts that come through their head, and that does not make them a racist in some sense. Or with the environment. I mean, you think about the first person who came to the Red River Valley, I don't think had any responsibility for worrying about ecological consequences of their behaviors. I think they could pee in the Red River, they could throw their garbage in the Red River, they could put a farm right next to the Red River, and there's no moral blame to be put on that. I mean, you know, they throw some chicken bones in the Red River, some giant catfish will eat those things up, it won't be a problem. Now it's a problem. Now we have cities upon cities upon cities upon the Red River, and it makes a difference what happens, what people do on the Red River. It makes a difference how we handle the Red River, the flooding. I mean, there's a lot of consequences. And so where there was no consequence once, and now there are big consequences now, and there are going to be more future consequences. So one of the things that Socrates' paradox suggests is that our moral decisions are about anticipating future situations, trying to worry today about what's going to happen in the future, and how to make arrangements or make provisions today to handle the future. Another lesson that the Socrates paradoxes teaches about moral encounters is that moral encounters are themselves a kind of quest. When you encounter the moral situation, there's not a right or wrong answer necessarily right there that we can see. That you have to, in some sense, go through a process of seeing where this is going, seeing how this is tending, seeing what the general trajectory of this situation is before a kind of meaning or a kind of moral lesson will begin to emerge. For me, this is pervasive. In my proposal to Jack, it was about Socrates and movies. And if you think about what it's like to watch a movie, so my favorite philosopher these days, I change philosophers as I grow older. Different ones pop up for me that seem more important. When I was in graduate school at Wittgenstein, now it's Charles Sanders Peirce, a great American philosopher. And one of the things he says is that the world is in a constant process of evolution, and what characterizes all evolution is a movement from vagueness to the definiteness. And if you think about that in the situations that we encounter in the world, like a child, who a child is pretty vague. Who they're going to become is very vague, right? They're children. You see a personality there, but you don't really know what they're going to become. An artist, a business person, a computer person, who knows? By the time you're my age, the vagueness is very low, and what I am is very high. So the possibilities, sort of as you grow older, the possibilities decrease and the definiteness increases. The vagueness decreases and the definiteness increases. And the same thing happens in a movie, right? When you start watching a movie, you don't know where this is going. It's very vague. You don't know what the moral is. You don't know who the good people are or who the bad people are. But as you watch the movie unfold, it becomes more and more definite as it goes along until you get to the end where ideally you'll see both what the plot of the movie is and you'll have some kind of notion of a moral lesson. And I think the same thing happens basically in the process of a moral encounter. That is, the answer is not going to be immediately given, but it will emerge over time as you watch and see how it develops. And so part of the lesson is to wait and watch and be reflective of how this situation is developing and going. That's the way we make friends. That's the way we choose a career. That's the way we choose a college. That's the way we get married, right? I mean, getting married, it begins quite vaguely. You don't know that this is the person that you're going to marry, but it becomes more and more definite as time goes on. So that's the so that moral decisions are more like a quest, more like an unfolding process than they are about being right and wrong. Frankly, I think that I would want to say that there is no belief that's inherently a bad belief. What I would want to say is that there are only better or worse methods for confirming your beliefs. That is, wherever you start, whatever bad belief you might start with, if you have this intent of seeing how your belief correlates with the way the world is emerging, with the way the situations are moving from vague to more definite, then you will be self-correcting very fast, and you'll give up bad beliefs and adopt better beliefs very quickly. If you have this idea that your beliefs are certain or right, or that you're on the right side of the question, and that there's not going to be any problem of change for you because you know you're already right, then I think you're already wrong, even if you have a good belief. Even if your belief is a beautiful belief, because of the way the world evolves, the way the world changes, any sort of fixed belief like that is going to be, I think the problem of the whole paradox of the sorority suggests that that's not going to last. That won't last. Whatever makes your belief beautiful today will make it potentially dangerous in some future time. And so the most important thing is that you're being flexible and learning to adopt new beliefs. How am I doing for time here? I could talk more about this, but I think I'll say just one more thing, and then I will kind of open this up for questions and discussion and anything that anybody wants to talk about. The final thing I just want to mention is that so there's this great Slovenian philosopher, cultural critic named Slavoj Žižek. I happen to be a big fan of Slavoj Žižek. I love reading his books. I love saying his name. One of the things that he said, he has a book called Violence. And in the book on violence, he says that language is inherently violent. There's something violent in language. And I think that what he means, at least in part, is that there's a way in which when we use words make it sound like the world is fixed. Like there's a chair and there's a table and this is the situation. And this is right and this is wrong. And that does violence to the fact that the world is in fact more like a flow, more like a constant change, more like a process of evolution. And so there's a way in which we are seduced by our own language to have these notions of certainty and definiteness that it does violence to the world, does violence to the people we encounter and deal with, and it does violence to our own lives. And so I think the beauty of the Socrates paradox is that it has this destructive, this power to destroy presumptions of certainty. I think it does, because it's so good at emphasizing vagueness in any concept. And I think it has this constructive ability to show how to work with vagueness, how to work with change, how to work with emergent meanings. So that's just the final thing that I'll say as my talk about this. But so I find, wherever I look, Socrates, the issue of the Socrates paradox pops up for me, and it seems like an underappreciated philosophical tool, a tool that should be more prominently displayed for people for thinking about their situations and their issues, and I think that's all I have to say. So I'd love to hear what people think about the Socrates paradox, or questions, or whatever you want to do. Yeah.
Would you use the microphone so that the folks who are watching know if you hear? Oh, just grab that one. You can take it out if you don't want to say it.
It seems as though when defining then what is more, it seems very individualistic, like people are going through this individual growth process.
Yep, good.
Since we live in communities,
yep.
How important is it for a community to define something,
yes.
to use a sharpening or something
yep.
like that?
Yep.
And how do you go about that process with people on such different stages in their journeys? How do you come together?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. One thing I want to say is it's not exactly the question you asked, but I want to say this, is that what I understand, to speak of the world as being in this constant process of change, and so inherently all our ideas and the things that we say about it are inherently vague, is not the same as relativism at all. It's not relativistic at all. There are real meanings that emerge as far as I'm concerned. There are moral rights and wrongs. I think it's morally right to be worried about the Q-tips in the glass between 3 and 7, and morally reprehensible not to worry about that in some fundamental sense. Same with issues of racism and environmental. So it's not relativistic. But you're absolutely right. It's not. I would say it's not an individual thing at all. It's actually it is an individual thing, but it's also a communal thing. The paradigm of this kind of activity for Peirce is the scientific community. That is, you have a group of people who are working individually, but they're working towards a common end. They're working towards a common understanding of, so you have microbiologists, and you have, they're working on one bacterium, and another is working on another bacterium, and they're all working together to come up with one explanation of this bacterium, and these are this bacterium, and those two, talking about these two different bacterium for, an understanding of a higher life. And that, it seems to me, is the paradigm, is that sort of scientific, progressive, trying to see how things are emerging, see how meanings are emerging, both individually and then going back to the community and contributing to a communal understanding of these things. So that paradigm of Nietzsche's, philosopher quest it goes for all of our moral quests, I think, in some sense. So that's a good question, though.
So you mentioned Zizek, and I have to wonder, he writes to Badiou often.
Yes.
And they write to each other, and Badiou's got this idea of fidelity to the event.
Yes, he does. Fidelity to the event.
How do you account for that in a flexible, fluid, ever-evolving
I think
world?
I think that yeah. So I would say that Badiou's idea of fidelity to the event is what I'm talking about. That is, I understand that his notion of a fidelity to an event is like a classic event for Badiou is love. There are political events, but love is one too, right? And so the fidelity to the love event will mean being unfaithful to the love event will mean abandoning the love event when things counterindications come up because you're not flexible enough. You expect it to be one way, and when it turns out not to be exactly the way you expected, you abandon it because, ooh, surprise, things change. And I think that what Badiou means by fidelity to the event is that you follow it out the way it emerges in its meanings and its signs, and that so real fidelity is to remain faithful to this process of moving from vagueness to more definite, no matter where that definite goes, in some sense. A political event, the same kind of thing. And that infidelity to the event is when it disappoints you because it doesn't do what you expect it to. What it doesn't conform to your preconditioned expectations, which is what most people do, I think. Most people, they love an event until it starts going a little strange, and then they abandon it because, ooh, I can't handle it. So that's what I would say. But you're right, that they do talk a lot, and Zizek talks about Badiou all the time, yeah.
The paradox of the heap makes me think about, and you're saying that the more set we are in our values, the more we tend to, in the end, break them or stray away from them. Makes me think about for instance, when I hear about the TV evangelists who are standing up there promoting moral values, and maybe they're preaching against homosexuality or whatever, and then a while later you hear, oh yeah, they were discovered in a hotel room with a man, or later on, the politician who is promoting, not taking bribes. But is that really the paradigm of the heap, or is it more just power corrupts, and is it more just human nature? So how do you explain that?
Okay, that's a lot of questions, but I will say, first of all, I think that what the Sorites paradox suggests about our relationship to ourselves and to the world demands a great deal of courage. That is, if the world is constantly changing, you have a responsibility to constantly change too. So, for example, I would say, this may seem reprehensible, but I would say, for example, that that it doesn't matter whether you are pro-homosexual rights or anti-homosexual rights to start with. What matters is that as things emerge, as the situations become more definite, you are responsive to those changes. So I think it would be, in some sense, less reprehensible to be sort of anti-homosexual maybe 50 years ago, and I think it's becoming increasingly more reprehensible because of the way we understand more. This is more of a community conversation about homosexuality. We have a different sense of the rights of homosexuals as opposed to heterosexuals. That this is these are shared rights. So I think the issue of homosexuality, for example, is becoming more definite, less vague. for homosexuals, as it did for women's rights, as it did for racial rights, as it has, these are the trends. These are evolutionary trends. But it's very hard to be open to change like that. We want to have certainty. We think that, at least we think we want to have certainty. I think we think that we want to have certainty, but we don't want to have certainty, because what certainty does is it puts you in opposition to the way the world is. It puts you in opposition to the way other people are who are tracking what's going on in the world are doing. And so I think that those televangelists, for example, I think they're preaching to people's worst fears. They're preaching certainty to people who are afraid that they're not going to be able to keep up with what's going on around them, and they want to hear that thing of certainty. And I think that I think there may be no relation whatsoever between what they're preaching and what they're thinking and feeling inside, which obviously frequently it seems like has to do with making a lot of money or having strange sexual things. So I think they're giving people what people think they want. I just think that that's a bad thing that they're doing, because they're not giving people what they really want, what they really need. And that people are hypocrites. I mean, the way that certainly makes hypocrites of us all. And we all are, I do not exclude myself from that at all. I mean, I think I have as much of an attraction to being right and certain as anybody in the world does. And I will, I'll fight for my being right until I realize, oh, I'm wrong. But that's like the greatest gift I can get, is to realize that I'm finally wrong, that's what I need to see. So I don't know if that completely answers your question, but.
I have a question.
Okay.
In terms of what you just said about slavery being being in favor of slavery, or being in favor of anti-homosexual,
right.
less deplorable, is the Socrates paradox epistemological, meaning is it about what people know, or is it metaphysical and about what is actually right and wrong? So would you want to say that being opposed to homosexuality was wrong 150 years ago, it's just excusable that people didn't know it? Or slavery was wrong 150 years ago, it was just excusable that people didn't know it? Or do you want to say it's not clear that it was right or wrong because these things are so community defined, which goes back to two of the questions from the audience?
Yeah, I guess I am sort of grudgingly going in that direction. That is, I think that that these values have to be communally discovered as they have to be individually discovered. And so the best communities are the communities that respond well when counterindications occur. Just as the best individual is the individual who responds well when counterindications occur. I mean, I would say something like, I think that slavery really was wrong, and that the most sensitive people saw it. But that in some sense, I think that people who didn't see slavery as wrong are not inherently bad people, except for if they are dogmatic about that, except for if they won't listen to the contrary arguments. If they behave that way, then I think that they are wrong. So I'm not saying that slavery is okay if a community thinks it's okay. I'm saying that whether or not it's okay will emerge over time. And that, I think it's one of the fascinating things that I think of, try to think about, are what are the things that we do today that in 150 years will look like slavery to us, right? I mean, what are the things that we're doing today that will look like people will just say about us, how could they have done that? How could they be doing those things? How could they think those things about these people? Or, and I'm sure, there's no doubt in my mind that we are guilty of things that we don't know we're guilty of, but people will see we're guilty of. I mean, maybe driving our cars. Maybe that's the thing people will say, well, what were they thinking? I mean, how could they, they killed everybody doing that. So I don't know, but I think that if we're responsive and trying to pay attention, then that's as good as we can be. We can't help the minds that we are being given socially, but we can be responsive to the indications, the signs of where they're going, and that's our responsibility. We can't be responsible, I think, in some sense, for the ideas we have, but we can be responsible for our method of being responsive, and that's what I think the Socrates paradox is constantly pointing to. It doesn't, whether it's a heap or not, and the question with a heap, really for me, the answer to the heap question is not is it a heap or not. The answer is it heaping or not heaping? That's the answer. That is, the really important question is, you could have two heaps, and one is heaping, that is, it's growing in heaping, and the other is diminishing in heaping, right? And that's the interesting thing. Where is this going? What's happening here? You could have two people with the same number of hairs on their head, and one of them is balding. They had a lot more hair on their head, last year, and they have fewer hairs now. The question is not, is one bald or is one not bald? The question is more, where is this going? What is happening here? And that's a future that engages where, how we're going to deal with and thinking about this towards the future. So that's the question I think that's operative is not so much what's right or wrong about the current situation. It's how is this going and how do we respond responsibly? How do we respond morally to where this situation is going? Which is what I suddenly sensed with those, the 3 Q-tips in the jar. This is going in a bad direction. I got to think about this. I have to deal with this. And I think it's self-interested. I think this is not just pure, rational. I don't think it's pure goodwill. I mean, I think I'm worrying about the Q-tips because I want to live in a household that doesn't have a lot of friction and hostility in it. And this is a small gesture, in that direction. And I know that if I don't pay attention to those kinds of things, then there will be more hostility. And I don't want. And so I think, in every case, paying attention to where things are going is going to contribute to that kind of sort of reconciliation of tensions and amelioration, making things better. That's the ideal. I'm sort of influenced by that whole pragmatic thing in my Sorites thinking. Peirce was very fascinated by vagueness. He didn't talk about the Sorites, but he talked a lot about vagueness.
I guess whenever I think of or hear speeches like this, I always think of education.
Yes.
I think of the students.
Yes.
And my cousin committed suicide because of bullying. And whenever I think of bullying, you just think of how much is could teacher have done something about this or not? And when is bullying enough? When isn't it enough? I know you kind of already hit the nail on the head on this already, but I'd like to hear your.
No, I know that's a terrible story, and. Yeah, there was a lecture on our campus during chapel the other day. A guy whose nephew was a Marine in the Marines, and he was homosexual, and he hanged himself because of the. Yeah, I mean, it's about. I mean, I think it's about education. I think you're right. It's about education. And I think it's about. So there's going to be some bullying in school. Obviously, you're not going to stop that. You can't stop bullying. But there's so between no bullying and too much bullying, there's a dark area, and I think it's a very difficult thing. But I think talking about it, because when you start talking about it, then the community begins to make judgments, and when the community starts making judgments, then the meanings emerge. If you don't talk about it, if you don't pay attention to it, then the meanings won't emerge, and it gets ignored. And that's what, so people who are invested in the norm and the status quo don't want people talking about it, because to talk about it they know is going to change things. So people who have children who are bullies or on the top of the bully hierarchy are not going to want to talk about it. And people at the bottom of the bully hierarchy are probably going to want to talk about it, but there'll be pressures to silence those people. And the only thing we could do is to have the courage to try and initiate the conversations where we see it happening, where we see the potential for happening. I mean, I think that's sort of what you're suggesting, and I think that's right. I think that's all we can do. And I think, furthermore, I am hopeful in this way that if people do talk about it, they'll come to the right. They'll see it, and they'll see a right solution. They'll see a solution that will be better than just allowing bullies to beat up people so that they're terribly humiliated. So that's. I mean, I think that's the thing. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for those questions. Those were great questions, and I had a good time. So, thanks.